When analyzing Starfleet diplomacy based on Federation policy, it can be somewhat confusing. Not only do we need to analyze the differences among various eras in Trek, but also examine the ways interaction is necessitated, given that the various types of diplomacy will be different for every culture encountered. Generally, first contact is expected to occur as an interaction between a Starfleet captain and some counterpart, whether that counterpart be another captain or government official. It likely is to be something unplanned with neither side truly ready, though sometimes the Federation would be aware of another civilization and be able to meet under controlled terms. Even something as simple as opening a dialogue can be terribly complicated. There are different departments and agencies that will try to work in tandem to ensure that a negative encounter doesn't occur. In that vein, this analysis will break down the ways that diplomacy works and how every captain is effectively an ambassador of peace or war, and the impacts of Federation and Starfleet influence. The role of Starfleet and its captains has always been something hotly debated, even within Starfleet itself. The organization is part trade organization, part military, part aid fleet, and even part diplomatic corps. The skipper of every ship has to wear many hats, regardless of what era they served in. When it comes to diplomacy, the captain must weigh the lives of themselves and their crew against the needs of the other cultures and even the whole of the Federation. To quote Jean-Luc Picard,
"We're out here to explore, to make contact with other life forms, to establish peaceful relations but not to interfere. And absolutely not to destroy."
Or even Sisko when he's talking to the wormhole aliens.
"It is the unknown that defines our existence. We are constantly searching, not just for answers to our questions, but for new questions. We are explorers. And we explore the galaxy, trying to expand the boundaries of our knowledge. And that is why I am here. Not to conquer you with weapons or with ideas, but to coexist and learn."
From everything that we observe, no matter what hat the Starfleet captain is wearing, his first mission is to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Everything else, with certain exceptions, is secondary to this goal. But Starfleet isn't the only entity that deals with diplomacy. We know that a Starfleet diplomatic corps does exist. Unfortunately, there is far much less that we know about said entity. It's not as explored within the various series as it should have been. From everything that I can tell, the institution was a combination of Starfleet and Federation personnel with its own hierarchy and internal structure. The use of Federation ambassadors and negotiators are a staple of Federation galactic affairs that can be seen throughout Starfleet's existence. Hell, well into the 24th century, ambassadors and diplomatic personnel are stationed as intermediaries on even core member worlds such as Vulcan and Tellarite. In most all situations dealing with other species, it would appear that the diplomatic corps eventually replaces initial Starfleet personnel for long-term maintenance of a relationship. Various episodes seem to indicate that Starfleet captains and officers are the first to establish a dialogue and even begin initial negotiations for trade. Both first contact and even second contact is handled by Starfleet, and then when things seem relatively peaceful, the diplomatic corps move in to secure a long-term relationship and ultimately finalize trade, alliances, and even membership. However, as with anything, the different eras accentuate to what level of policy, what level of friendship that the Federation and Starfleet are willing to offer. If you've been a fan of this channel for any length of time, you'll know that I consistently talk about the fact that the United Federation of Planets was born of blood and battle. It was initially a military alliance. The original coalition of planets, its precursor, was an amalgamation of species that came together for mutual protection and trade. When the Romulans continued their malfeasance upon the Alpha and Beta quadrants, the Vulcans, Tellarites, Humans, and Andorians banded together to defeat them and ultimately form the Federation. The fledgling Federation was created to stop internal strife and for mutual protection. A seemingly authoritarian democracy with ultimate power over its member worlds. The cost of a government's sovereignty would come with very lucrative benefits, though. Member worlds enjoyed representation within the Federation to sway civilian and Starfleet policy, as well as access to technologies and trade of other governments. not to mention the Common Defense. There isn't a lot of information on the period just past the formation of the United Federation of Planets, at least as of the upload of this video. But from everything that can be parsed, this deal would be something extremely tempting given Klingon and Romulan encroachment growing ever and ever more prevalent. Starfleet captains would begin to explore and assist other worlds against common threats, whether they were members or not, and by doing so, begin what some would call Federation indoctrination. Let's take a look. Hey guys, I'm excited to tell you about a very cool partnership. Have you ever wanted to be able to share emojis that have audio with your friends via text that are based on this channel? Yeah, me neither, but that won't stop me from trying to sell it to you anyway. Emojam is a cool downloadable app that will let you send clips of me and cool GIFs based on the channel. You can click in the link below to download and get your first GIF free. For those who want to be true lore masters, if you become a YouTube member by hitting that cool join option and pledging $5 or more, you'll get even more GIFs based on the channel. That's right, my dearest fans. You can send all kinds of fun emojis to everyone and they'll instantly like you because they'll know my channel. So again, on your phone, click the link below, download Emojam and get started, because God knows CBS isn't going to give me money.
We offer you two choices. Leave immediately or open a dialogue with us. Hopefully it is the latter, so that we can re-engage with the Klingon Empire and prove to you that now, as always, we come in peace.
At some point, the Klingon Empire fell into complete disarray with individual houses being at war with other houses. This combined with the Romulan Star Empire becoming less and less prevalent for some reason would mean that the Federation was able to expand well beyond its original borders. This exploration resulted in first contact with a multitude of governments and planets. In turn, these interactions resulted in many non-member worlds suing for and obtaining Federation membership. Unfortunately, like what we would see in the future with the 24th century, Starfleet found itself being initially unequaled and thus unchallenged by an entity that could do it harm. Because of this, Starfleet members began to see themselves as solely scientists, and Starfleet as a scientific and diplomatic organization only. Additionally, the ethos of the Federation would start to shift from exploration to expectation. The United Federation of Planets wanted to explore the galaxy, finding new ideas and new peoples. The need to seek out new ethos and share their own would blind them to a simple fact. Sometimes people in governments want to be left alone. Starfleet influence and power would spread and finally reach the outermost borders of the broken Klingon Empire. Federation ideology would result in Starfleet being ill-prepared for any major conflict, and even worse, lacking an understanding that you can't force your ideas on others, even inadvertently, and that sometimes you have to stop your own expansion to keep the peace. Fear of Starfleet change and diversity united the Klingon Empire and pit the Federation in a war that it almost lost. The destruction and devastation of this conflict effectively reset the Federation and its diplomatic policy. Once again, the citizens of the member worlds were reminded that you must be able to defend your own before you can explore.
Dr. McCoy is right in pointing out the enormous danger potential in any contact with life and intelligence as fantastically advanced as this. But I must point out that the possibilities, the potential for knowledge and advancement is equally great.
The Klingon War of 2256 to 2257 had a devastating effect on Federation and Starfleet policy. Starfleet became more militaristic, with an extreme focus on internal affairs. The organization was more concerned with ensuring that member worlds were provided with food, weapons, and defenses than it was with exploring. Don't get me wrong, Starfleet would continue scientific enterprises as well as exploration, but a more tempered approach was taken. Individual vessels were designated for specific missions, including defense, science research, trade, and exploration. The spirit of Starfleet captains would be such that the need to explore and make meaningful first contact was still there. It was still a passion, but they did have other priorities as well. However, Federation membership would be granted at a slower rate, and the Federation Council also included Starfleet officers as a voting bloc. Tensions with the Klingons were always high at this point, and the brink of war was a looming specter. Because of this, special exceptions would be made in the Prime Directive, the guiding principle of Starfleet, that allowed them to interact with cultures that were not ready for first contact to combat this threat. Even with the Klingons and Romulans continuing to threaten Federation sovereignty, the borders of the UFP continued to grow, with its culture expanding even further and faster than the borders themselves. The Klingon Empire attempted to counter this by pouring all of its economy into wartime production, a fatal mistake as the infrastructure of their empire ultimately failed and would doom the civilization without help. The Federation, seeing an opportunity both to assist and create peace, reached out to the Klingons, who accepted. There would still be some trying times, but the Klingon Empire and United Federation of Planets eventually crafted a strong alliance, effectively freeing up resources on the Klingon borders, as well as further nullifying the threat of the Romulan Star Empire. This also would create trade and interspecies discussions, which would cause the Klingons to become more and more like the culture of the Federation. And with all of this, the golden age of the Federation would be obtained.
The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth. It is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based.
The early to mid-24th century would oddly reflect the values of the early to mid-23rd century. With the Romulan threat virtually non-existent and the Klingons now allies, Starfleet once again became complacent. The officers started believing that they were, once again, mainly explorers, and that combat is a small purview of a captain's skill set. The science and culture of the Federation exponentially expanded again. Species started coveting what the Federation had, many opting to join in. While this was a period of great naivete for Starfleet, they wouldn't be entirely stupid. There is both dialogue and events that indicate Starfleet admirals and some Federation dignitaries might have seen the ending of the Age of Expansion coming, that the Golden Age was on its last legs. At some point, the Federation, and by necessity Starfleet, started fast-tracking member worlds into the fold. As I've noted before, this trend wouldn't stop till well after the Dominion War. The oncoming incursions of enemies would cause political and public relation blunders across the board. The most notable being the Cardassian Treaty, where the Federation betrayed its own citizens. Well, arguably betrayed, that's a topic I've discussed in other videos. The Romulan Star Empire would once again start becoming an issue. The Borg Collective and Dominion would also make appearances and put pressure on an already stretched thin Starfleet, causing the scientific and diplomatic expansion to slow down significantly. Unfortunately, Starfleet captains and the Federation's diplomatic corps wouldn't know how to handle these threats directly. In the past 20 to 100 years, Federation influence was so great that war and combat were rarely needed. The Federation could simply pressure other empires to bend to their whims, or at least force them to negotiate. Starfleet officers began to think that their ideals were universal, that space was available for everyone to explore. They balked at the thought that someone could think otherwise. Anyone who had wrongthink, like the Maquis, were simply thought to be misinformed. These people had lost their way as Federation citizens. Someone would need to remind them how lovely paradise was. Given this ideology that borders on idiocy, the Borg and Dominion once again proved how Starfleet influence sometimes wasn't enough, and would cripple their attempts to expand. Militaristic elements within Starfleet, similar to those seen in the 23rd century, would gain more and more power throughout the Federation. All of this would come to a head when, once again, the Federation was plunged into war.
I wish they'd just attack and get it over with.
I have the feeling you're going to get your wish.
While the Cardassians, Romulans, and Borg caused tremors within Starfleet and its protocol at first contact, the pompous attitude of Starfleet was destroyed when ultimately they had to go to war with the Dominion. The Dominion, unlike other enemies, was as charismatic a government as they were. The Dominion could spread its influence similar to how the Federation did. Both Dominion raw power and their ambassadors were able to show Federation weakness and even make Starfleet seem to be hypocritical. Arguably, the attitudes seen by Starfleet officers and Federation dignitaries at this time probably created resentment in the various quadrant powers that the Dominion would be able to pounce upon. It would be during this period that many Starfleet officers recognized the failures of Federation diplomacy. The way the Federation had worked in the past worked out very well when Starfleet had an even fight. When Starfleet historically could fight to a stalemate, or the Federation could apply diplomatic pressure and let their cultural ideals win the day. On a side note, this is how Starfleet most likely forced the Cardassians to leave Bajoran space, but now they would have to be much more proactive in both military and diplomatic affairs. During the Dominion conflict, Starfleet captains fought a losing war, while the Federation Council and Diplomatic Corps attempted to convince others to join the fight, namely the Romulans, the Ferengis, and others. It is ironic how Starfleet changed the tide of the war, though. It wouldn't be the noble speeches or heroic events that convinced the Romulans to join. There was no grand showing of superior ability. It just had a cost associated to it. All it cost was the life of one Romulan senator, one criminal, and the self-respect of one Starfleet officer. I don't know about the viewers watching this episode, but I'd call that a bargain. And given that we know the Admiralty were aware of at least the attempts to lie to the Romulans, Starfleet would truly forsake all of its morals to ensure a Federation alliance victory. This would not be the only time the morals of Starfleet and its Admiralty caved. Admiral Ross partnered with Section 31, a Black Ops organization that worked without oversight from Starfleet, to imprison an innocent Romulan senator and install a mole permanently on the Romulan Council. This same organization, namely Section 31, fashioned a virus that was meant to genocide the entire race of the Changelings, the heads of the Dominion, in an attempt to nullify the Dominion threat. This, of course, failed, given that some officers found out about it. The end of the Dominion War resulted in a Federation alliance victory. The Alpha and Beta quadrants would be in tatters with every major society burning, but even in the rubble, Federation dominance was assured. For a long time after this, Starfleet would be the most powerful military and the United Federation of Planets the most powerful influencer that could reach far into the Alpha, Beta, and possibly even Gamma quadrants. The Dominion may have diminished the light of the Federation for a small time, but now the Federation's reach raged like a fire. As the governments all attempted to rebuild after the war, the Federation authorized Starfleet to create stronger and more powerful vessels for science, exploration, and war. Virtually every ship designed would daylight as a science vessel ready to go to battle. Though again, as things do, after a while, Starfleet began to become lax with these standards. Unlike before, however, it would never forget what almost happened. The vessels, while starting to be a bit more relaxed in their ability to fight, would still be designed with specific tasks like technical work, but have the ability to withstand a prolonged encounter. A brief coup in the Romulan Star Empire brought Starfleet once again close to another war, but luckily it would be averted. Starfleet, once again, would reach out to the stars and begin to explore. They would seek out new life and new civilization, and they would spread their specific values onto others, whether they meant to or not. This wouldn't last forever, though. The more Starfleet expanded, the more power the Federation had, the more everything began to shift. The Federation's influence became so vast that it would, ironically, start to become very, very insular. An example included the Federation begrudgingly assisting the Romulans when they needed help, only to completely pull back all support when the Starfleet Mars installation was destroyed by rogue androids. The Federation, the entity that strived to reach all other civilizations and help as much as they could for 3 to 4 centuries, would lose complete understanding of its original purpose. Would exist to only continue to exist, to ensure its survival and not others. Everything that has a beginning does have an end. This would ring true for the Federation's influence as well. At some point in time, an event occurred known as the Burn. This event, which resulted in every ship with an active warp core exploding, effectively destroyed the Federation and Starfleet. By this time, the government had grown so strong and powerful it had become oppressive to individual members, requiring them to work towards the goal of the many at the expense of the few. Its influence spanned far in all directions, but would be snuffed out to a regional power in virtually a second. The Starfleet of the 32nd century would be barely able to protect itself, let alone explore. The policy of survival to keep the Federation running would stay for a long, long time. Starfleet wouldn't be able to assist others even if they wanted to. They had to expend resources to fight cartels. That was a large endeavor for them at this point. Luckily, Starfleet would identify why the burn occurred so they could prevent it from the future, as well as find a dilithium nursery. The Federation would, once again, be able to return to the stars. Let's take a step back for a second. For DS9 fans, I know you may be wondering why I haven't played the Eddington clip, especially during the Deep Space Nine piece of this breakdown. Specifically, the truth is that Eddington isn't wrong, but based on the dialogue and events that we see in all of the series, I don't believe that it was ever the intent of Starfleet or the Federation to do what they did. I don't think the Federation ever intended for its culture, and indeed its values, to seep into those around them. It was just something that happened as the exchange of ideas occurred. This assimilation was slow and almost invisible. It was so insidious that it not only impacted those outside of the Federation's culture, but within it as well. By the golden age of the next generation, we see that officers of the Federation believe that they hold a special place in the galaxy. This only gets worse when we see in Deep Space Nine that the worst sin anyone could do is to tell the Federation that they are wrong. While the Dominion War would knock them down a peg, they would continue to build, and now have a military might to ensure their influence. While we see that Starfleet loses its way, when it comes to the Federation and Starfleet diplomatic policy, in the end, I honestly think Pike sums it up. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.
Starfleet is a promise. I give my life for you, you give your life for me. And nobody gets left behind.